Yes, he was born Nelson Mandela in a village called Qunu, somewhere in the Transkei. He was a freedom fighter, a humanitarian, an icon in the world. He lost his battle to lung cancer, to a lung illness on December the 5th. That was Nelson Mandela. To speak about his life, we have Father Michael Lapsley. And Father Michael Lapsley is the director for the Institute for Healing Memories in Cape Town, South Africa. Father Michael Lapsley is also a member of the ANC who joined the movement sometime in 1975 from New Zealand, where he had been ordained as a minister in Australia, actually, and came to serve in South Africa. So he grew up in South Africa with the experience of apartheid. So he's going to speak to us on the life of Nelson Mandela. Whilst the rest of the world celebrates his life, we too want to honor and celebrate Nelson Mandela. Father Michael Lapsley, welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you and all your viewers everywhere.
Thank you very much. We know that obviously Nelson Mandela's life is being celebrated instead of being mourned, because he's a man who's left a remarkable impact on anybody who he has met and also has never met. I mean, the world over, people have come close and have gathered together in his memory. And it's an example because on Tuesday, South Africa obviously hosted a memorial for him, and leaders from all different places, people from all different faiths came together, and they had one thing in common, and that was to bring love, peace, freedom, you know, and good cheer. And this is exactly what Nelson Mandela exuded. And people will ask a question: why would a man who spent 27 years behind bars, locked up just for crying freedom, come out of prison and be able to forgive those oppressors? So I know that you are in the field of obviously the ministry of religion, but you're also helping people to heal. So in your own understanding, and I think this is also part of your tribute that you wrote, you said, imagine for a moment what would have happened if Nelson Mandela had walked out of prison and said, it's time to get them. You say we would have all died in our millions, because it is said that revenge is when you drink poison and hope that someone else will die. Instead, Nelson Mandela said, never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. So those are loaded words. And can you please explain those sentiments that you wrote in your tribute?
Well, undoubtedly, the world was astounded, if not gobsmacked, when Nelson Mandela came out and responded in that way. And of course, before he went to prison, he said, I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. I have fought against white domination. I have fought against black domination. It's an ideal I hope to live for and to achieve. But if necessary, it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. Now, 27 years later, he comes out of prison and says exactly the same. And one of the things I learned from Nelson Mandela and the great leaders, Oliver Tambo, great leaders of our struggle, was that the only way that people of South Africa would be free would be through sacrifice and self-sacrifice.
Right.
So he had a moral vision that helped him make sense of the sacrifice he made of 27 years in prison. And I think that's a key part of why he came out without a trace of bitterness. And in reality, there were many Nelson Mandelas. There were many people in South Africa who had a moral vision of a common society in which black and white would live together as equals. And I think often it's people who perhaps are in the wrong place at the wrong time, who have and suffer, who have great trouble healing, where those who can make sense of their suffering are often not the ones consumed by hatred and bitterness. But of course, Nelson Mandela was clearly the paramount moral icon or moral example of that. And in a way, he appealed to the best in us as human beings. We all know we all carry a shadow side. We're capable of horrible things. But Nelson Mandela brought out, himself embodied and brought out the very best in all of us. And so what you're saying, Fungai, is indeed true, that South Africa is celebrating. But we're celebrating and we're sad at the same time, because indeed, of course, whilst his death at the age of 95 is not tragic, it's still sad. And I think many people in South Africa and across the world feel this week that they have lost a father. So there is a sense of loss that is indeed part of the mixture, part of the, as well as the joy and the celebration. But not only did Nelson Mandela, was he not characterized by bitterness, but in the first democratic parliament of South Africa, the piece of legislation which he championed, which was the most debated piece of legislation, was that which set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in the case of Nelson Mandela, undoubtedly his story was acknowledged, reverenced, recognized. People said, what happened to you was wrong.
Right. Now, you would be one of those people, because obviously you served under the ANC, and at a time where it was very dangerous, obviously, to be part of this movement where the apartheid regime wanted to keep everybody else oppressed. And you were on the side of the blacks, if I may put it, or the downtrodden. So as a result, you ended up receiving a parcel bomb because you're obviously on the hit list.
Yeah, so of course that's 3 months after the release of Nelson Mandela from prison.
Right.
So it was in the wake of his own release that this happened to me.
So you've gone ahead to live your life in the same form of forgiveness, and also decided to commit the rest of your life working to heal these kind of wounds. Now, South Africa has gone through a lot, and the question that everybody is challenged by is, how can you completely forgive somebody? You lost both your arms, you lost one eye, you got badly burnt. So can you explain to our viewers the process of healing from your own personal voice, so that they...
Well, I think in a sense, you see, like me, my story, like Nelson Mandela, my story was acknowledged and reverenced and recognized. And people said to me, what happened to me was wrong. Mm-hmm. And in my case, I was prayed for, I was loved, I was supported. And that was all pretty fundamental in my own journey of healing. But I realized, and I think Nelson Mandela realized too, that for millions of South Africans, their stories had not been acknowledged and reverenced and recognized. And that was why it was important to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But that gave a platform for about 23,000 people. But in reality, we are more like 45 million people. And so that was what led me with a group of colleagues to set up an institute for healing of memories, to create what we would call safe and sacred spaces, where people can begin to deal with how the nation's journey has affected them personally, and also how what happened to their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, how that has shaped them. Right. Often when we think about a nation, we say that's politics, sociology, economics. We think about an individual psychologically, sexually, emotionally, spiritually, but we don't always ask the question, how has the nation's journey affected us as individuals? To what degree has it damaged me? To what degree do I carry, if you like, toxicity of hatred and bitterness inside me? And so I realized that we could build the houses, we could provide the water, we could provide the electricity, but if we were still angry and bitter, we would not create a nice society. So it's speaking to that human dimension that my own work is, creating spaces where the journey of healing can happen, where people can leave behind that inside them which is destructive, but take from the past that which is life-giving. And of course,
Right.
for some people, a key part of that might be forgiveness.
Right.
But I want to suggest to you that healing is always important, whether or not there's a possibility of forgiveness.
Okay. Now, we're just going to go and look into the man Nelson Mandela. I mean, was a kid born obviously in the villages of the Transkei and raised in a very traditional way. Then when he later on got educated as a lawyer, came to the big cities, he took up boxing as a sport. And then when he got involved in the struggle, realized that somehow, you know, the ANC needed to arm themselves to get training. He received armed training in I think it was in Algeria, where, you know, as part of the Umkhonto where the left wing of the ANC. And then
the military wing of the ANC, yes.
The military wing of the ANC. Now, he preached peace, non-violence, you understand, reconciliation. How did he manage to balance those two? Because you'd think a boxer and a freedom fighter is somebody who's ready to go to battle. But at the same time, he had this discipline of conducting this kind of operation in peace and non-violent ways. So,
well, I think we have to see it in context. Nelson Mandela is a product of the people of South Africa. It's also a product of the ANC. And of course, the ANC struggled non-violently for nearly 50 years. Right. And it was only after increasing violence by the state, increasing repression, increasing denial of fundamental human rights, and after the massacre of Sharpeville was, if you like, the last straw. Right. And it was then that, you know, the ANC has a famous statement, the time comes in the life of any nation when there are only two choices, submit or fight. That time has now come to South Africa. Now, you know, most Western countries spend about 5 minutes before they start picking up arms in the face of some kind of conflict, where African people, in fact, spent nearly 50 years before very reluctantly they took that option. But even when they did in a very disciplined way. And so the first, if you like, attempts to make the white regime come to its senses were bombs that were exploded against economic installations. It was only later that they began to include the targets of
these were like
enemy personnel. Pardon?
These were acts of sabotage to force...
Precisely, acts of sabotage, yes. Yes.
Okay, so now I guess
I think also, Fungai, there's a problem sometimes with language, you know, because when the state used violence against the people, it was always called the defense of law and order. When black people eventually picked up arms, the words like violence and terrorism were used. So I think the language itself mystified the actual reality of state violence, of state terrorism used against an unarmed and defenseless people, which are the words, of course, of Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you are also part of those victims, because this was a state-sponsored act where somebody came and planted a bomb trying to kill you, and you're just one of the many that actually got, you know, affected like that as victims. But we'll move on, and I wanted to know the general feeling right now that Nelson Mandela is gone. There is obviously a tremendous sense of loss. But do you think...
Yeah, I think there's loss. I think there's loss, and at the same time, celebration. And in a way, we are getting wall-to-wall coverage of the things Nelson Mandela said and did throughout his life. So I think in a way there's a surge of new inspiration happening in the country, where people, if you like, are recovering and you know, helping us all to inculcate within ourselves and reminding ourselves of the deepest and most life-giving values and vision which Nelson Mandela embodied.
I attended the memorial last night, and this was at the Riverside Church in Harlem. And there were a lot of interfaith leaders, civil rights leaders, and politicians, mostly from the black community and others, who came to commemorate and remember Nelson Mandela. And I remember distinctively a speech by the Reverend Al Sharpton, who's a civil rights movement leader here in America, standing up and saying that there are those people who came to celebrate Nelson Mandela's life but do not act in a way to support what he stood for. And it's very evidenced by so many people that converged in that stadium in South Africa to memorialize him. And he said the question is, what happens from now? Is God telling us something through the life and the sufferings that Nelson Mandela went through? So what would you say, you know, as a mirror to the world, you know?
Well, I think in a way these days of national mourning are also providing an opportunity for deep introspection about where we are as a nation, where have we come since 1994 and far long before that, and also where do we want to go, and is the direction that we're taking. And I think this relates particularly to the way in which Nelson Mandela was a moral icon. Right. And in our country, sadly, we have more and more cases of corruption. And so people then look back to the days of Nelson Mandela and say that we need, if you like, new Nelson Mandelas at every level of society, who will be characterized by the willingness to sacrifice, not necessarily in the same way we did in the struggle years of dying, but living our lives for a better, kinder, gentler, more just society. So I think that's, if you like, the clarion call. And of course, we are not the only people in the world who are disillusioned by their current batch of political leaders. So I think part of the attraction of Nelson Mandela for the whole human family is precisely because we want moral and visionary leadership who don't simply mouth platitudes, but live out what they're saying. So even, you know, for example, it was Barack Obama made one of the greatest speeches of all there. Right. But some people have said, but okay, but are you going to stop using the drones? Are you going to release the Cuban Five? So whilst there was a great challenge coming from President Obama, the challenge goes back to him, as it indeed goes back to all world leaders, as to what they're actually doing, not just what they're saying. And I think the thing about Nelson Mandela, we saw him practicing what he preached.
So he kind of like set a moral compass, like you said, because it
Precisely.
was also evidenced in the terms of how the stadium responded when the president of South Africa's picture was superimposed on the screen. And it was not very impressive, but you then get to wonder what they're thinking and why. So it seems like the bar is kind of like pushed because of how Nelson Mandela lived and the principles that he served.
Yes, no, indeed, that is true. And there's an intense debate about that happened, and that there are, you know, the nation is divided in relation to the current president. But I think many people feel that that was neither the time nor the place for that to be expressed. And so there's great debate going on within the country about what happened in the stadium and whether it was appropriate or inappropriate. And probably there would be even those who would maybe not be supporters of the president would be not convinced that this was the right time for that to be expressed.
Sometimes you cannot control such a large crowd or even tell them.
That is true. You cannot guarantee. Right. And South Africans, we say what we think.
Right. Anyways, go ahead. I was going to say we thank you very much for coming to the program. Now, just before we close, I know you wrote a book, Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer. And this book has actually been hitting the circuit. You've been going around the world, signing and also launching it all over. Where can people find this book?
Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer.
Yeah.
It's published in the United States by Orbis. It's published in South Africa by Struik Christian Media, Struik, but also is available on Amazon. If you just Google Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer, you'll be able to find it. And you could also get it published, as I say, by Orbis, Orbis, and it can also be ordered from Orbis. And in the new year, it's coming out in German and also in Spanish for the whole of Latin America as well as the Bosnian language. So it's beginning to be translated into a range of languages, which is exciting because it doesn't simply tell my story, but is the story of the work of healing of memories,
Right.
which I'm finding resonates with human beings everywhere on the planet.
Right, that's true. Anyway, thank you very much, Father Michael Lapsley, for joining us. We hope to speak to you again. And we know that Nelson Mandela right now lies in state at the Union Building in South Africa. This is the place where he actually made his offices right after he came out of prison.
And it's also the place where he was inaugurated in 1994.
Right. And I think his burial is going to be in his home village in Kunu, and that will be on Sunday, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so that was Father Michael Lapsley, who's the director for the Institute for Healing of Memories. He was joining us via Skype in South Africa. Please stay tuned. We have more programming as Nelson Mandela's tributes continue to roll.